An old master went all out, throwing a devastating punch, but the armored monster was faster and hit him squarely in the stomach. The creature roared, full of fury. With a single blow, the monster sent all the warriors flying. He thought it wasn't bad for a bunch of kids. The monster looked down, calling them idiots. Then, a young man with white hair was caught. He felt like his bones were being ground. Even knowing the power difference was huge, the young man retaliated with a punch. The monster was shocked, wondering what that was. The creature called him a midget, totally underestimating the boy. But the young man was not intimidated and went for an insane exchange of punches. With his eyes shining, he unleashed all his power in a single blow. The two fists collided with absurd force. But the monster's strength was too much, and the young man began to be pushed back. The giant fist came down with everything, about to crush the boy. And the monster attacked again, demanding that he show more power. The white-haired young man defended himself with everything he had, feeling crushing pressure. He thought his bones were being broken down to the molecular level. The difference in power was simply huge. He couldn't handle the enemy. Amidst the pain, the protagonist thought that if he only had more strength, but he clenched his fist, determined not to give up. He thought that since the right person wasn't there, someone needed to take responsibility. The giant prepared a devastating attack to end everything at once. With pure anger and determination, the young man gathered his last strength and advanced against the monster's blow without fear. The impact of the two powers caused a gigantic explosion. On the ground, other warriors had already been defeated in battle. In another corner of the battlefield, the fight was also intense. Despair took over all the allies. After the dust settled, the protagonist was on his knees, completely exhausted. But even finished, his gaze showed that the fight was not over yet. A giant armored creature looked at the young man down below. His huge hand glowed, ready to attack. Behind the helmet, a monstrous face smiled maliciously. Without warning, the giant raised his foot, preparing to crush the white-haired boy. The impact was devastating, throwing the protagonist away with the force of the explosion. The monster just watched, cold and emotionless. Suddenly, the young man's companion shouted, using an ability to attract the enemy's attention. The strategy worked. The giant turned his head towards the new target. Fallen, the protagonist looked at his friend with pure despair on his face. The enemy clenched his fist, concentrating a deadly energy. The white-haired boy could only watch, completely helpless. He writhed in agony and rage, trembling because he couldn't do anything. And then, his friend was hit head-on by the attack. In that moment of despair, a dark voice in his mind asked if he truly wanted more power. A vision struck him. He was on his knees, surrounded by shadowy figures in the past. The shadowy figure stared at him as if offering a dangerous pact. Defeated, the young man with white hair couldn't take it anymore. Two shadowy figures appeared before him, like ghosts from the past. Memories of violent battles flashed through his mind. He remembered a companion in danger, screaming for help. He recalled a friend fighting with everything he had, and the death of his master right in front of him. But even with his body at its limit, he didn't give up. One of the figures offered him a new light, a new chance, and the protagonist accepted that power. Suddenly, an armored enemy advanced toward him, but his companion's shadow stepped in front to protect him. The enemy launched his technique, imitation-style target. The blow exploded with full force against the protector. The hooded figure screamed in pain from the impact. Filled with fury, the young man used divine imitation and charged. A sinister voice warned that he was the worst of all. And then, a mysterious man appeared with a smile full of malice. He was a guy who clearly enjoyed the chaos he caused. But he wasn't the only one. Another young man with white hair also seemed immersed in madness. Meanwhile, a hooded figure studied an ancient scroll about something called syndrome, and these two young men seemed to have a dark past that connected them. The battle had already begun, and an armored warrior couldn't handle the dark attack. An elf watched everything, completely shocked by what she saw, but the warrior wasn't going to fall so easily. His eyes gleamed with power. He focused his energy. It was time to show his strength as the supreme monarch, but the enemy also had a trick up his sleeve, revealing infinite power in his gaze. He used a copied technique, Ranard-style dissonance. The monarch was hit head-on, screaming in pain. That blow was devastating, a perfect and deadly imitation. With his power activated, the protagonist unleashed poisonous flame. A terrible memory came to his mind. A monster about to devour a girl. Remembering that fight, he focused a dark and red energy. His enemy at the time responded with a power of light. The clash of the two attacks caused a devastating explosion, but that battle was already over. Now, a new one was beginning. Suddenly, a flurry of golden punches flew in his direction. The protagonist dodged them all with absurd agility. In the midst of the chaos, he finally saw who the opponent was. Without a second thought, the young man prepared his red energy sphere. The opponent didn't back down and prepared a counterattack. The two powers collided with tremendous force. But something went wrong. The protagonist was surprised. The enemy simply passed through the explosion and came at him. The young man had to defend himself at the last second, blocking the punch with his arm. The protagonist scoffed, saying that the enemy had too many cheap tricks. The bald man didn't even see where the blow came from. A gigantic explosion of energy swept everything away. But the young man remained calm, as if nothing had happened. His power spread through the city in the form of petals. The enemy coughed, feeling the weight of the damage. He was trapped inside an energy lotus flower, completely immobilized. Sweat ran down his face. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Up above, the protagonist stared at him, wielding his massive sword. The opponent could only look up, completely defenseless. With a smirk, the young man prepared to finish him off. The man in the lotus felt that his end was near. He gripped the sword even tighter. His eyes shone with an overwhelming golden energy. And then, golden rays began to surround the enemy. The fight was about to end. His body was falling apart. Half of his face was already just a skull. He activated the power of reincarnation, an endless cycle of death and rebirth. And so, a new divine being was born, sitting on his throne, above everything and everyone. From up there, he watched the attack. An immense power was fired at his enemy. It was the cycle of life that he controlled. Countless souls waiting to be born again. But the opponent was not shaken. His eyes shone with unbreakable determination. The protagonist faced the divine being. He wasn't going to let that cycle continue. His attack advanced with everything, a powerful technique in the form of a lotus, and the blow hit directly. The divine being was trapped, unable to move. The protagonist then spoke. He said that the Buddha he knew had died a long time ago. This idea of just being a successor, someone wearing another's clothes, it was a thought that all the previous Buddhas had, the countless ones who died in this cycle. They all thought about it at least once, questioning who they really were. But a crazy smile appeared on his face. He seemed to have reached a conclusion. He wondered if that was enough to say that the old and current Buddha were different. His eyes reflected infinity, a never-ending cycle of pain. Life after life, he couldn't take it anymore. His original personality had shattered long ago. With each reincarnation, his mind wore down a little more. But now, he was going to bet everything he had left. The enemy unleashed a divine power, declaring himself to be Buddha. Thousands of golden hands emerged from his energy. It was his ultimate technique, the 1,000-hand Dharma wheel. And at the center of it all was our protagonist. But he didn't show a shred of fear. The young man advanced straight against the deadly attack. At that moment, his eyes also shone with an absurd power. The enemy couldn't believe it when the protagonist's hand touched his face. The protagonist's attack exploded with full force, completely destroying his opponent's divine technique. The enemy launched a devastating wave of energy at the young man. The opponent put all his strength into that blow. The blast exploded with a violent impact. But the attack was useless. The bald man was thrown away, screaming in pain. Shocked, the enemy wondered if what he saw were eyes. The protagonist just stared at him with a cold and calculating look. The opponent tried to warn him that he wouldn't get what he wanted, and then the secret was revealed. The two shared the same power in their eyes. Their battle echoed throughout the industrial city. Furious, he shouted that he had dedicated his whole life to that power. He wasn't going to give up. The man clenched his fist with all his rage and went all out. But the protagonist was already ready, advancing to the confrontation. The two forces collided in an explosion of absurd power, and with a determined look, the young man managed to stop the blow. The giant enemy called him a reckless bastard. With pure fury, the bald man concentrated all his energy into the attack. Suddenly, a scream of agony echoed. The power was so great that the villain could barely control it, but the protagonist activated his own technique. Flower petals appeared out of nowhere. On the young man's face, a smile of pure confidence. The enemy's face changed to pure despair. The pain was unbearable. He couldn't defend himself. Out of nowhere, a giant dark skull appeared, swallowing the villain. The protagonist watched, as if he already knew this was going to happen. The villain's gaze was one of pure dread, and with his sword in hand, the young man advanced to end it all.